Hi, folks. Welcome to Diversity in Society. This course can be referred to as Introduction to Ethnic Studies. It could be referred to as Race, Class, and Gender. Essentially, what we're looking at is what are the implications of diversity in our societies? Um, how do we understand it, and how do we unpack it to make it more understandable for us as we move forward? Um, when you start to think about race and ethnicity in the United States, um, what you really want to understand is how is the racial composition in the United States changing? Historically, we had been a predominantly white society, and there's always been an influx of immigrants coming into this country. The first period of our immigration was primarily Northern European and Southern European, um, and then from places around the world. So, how is that racial composition changing? If you look at this graph, we see that the percentage of white people will be diminishing in reference to the population as a whole. It doesn't necessarily mean there will be less white people in the United States. It just means that there will be other groups that are um, growing in comparison to the white population. Um, Hispanic Americans, we will see growing over the course of the next 50 years. This is you'll hear in political arenas how the Hispanic vote is going to influence the electorate for years to come, and that the electorate is changing demographically. But that assumes that Hispanic is a uh, well-defined group and that they all vote in a similar fashion, which there's plenty of evidence that suggests otherwise. Um, you've got blacks and Native Americans who are pretty much going to stay about the same levels of our population as they are right now. Blacks are about 12, 13%. Native Americans are about 1 or 2%. That's not going to change. But Asian and Pacific Island Americans is on the rise as well. So, understanding how those categories are changing in the United States really gives great insight to how you are seeing it play out in your lives if you watch the news um, or just watch the changing dynamics and demographics in your own neighborhoods, your towns. You see that things are changing and there are implications to those changes. Um, Historically, we have been a land of immigrants. Since the 1960s, the number of immigrants arriving in the United States each year has tripled and includes groups literally from all over the globe. As I mentioned earlier, the types of people coming into the United States were predominantly white, um, which gave them the ability to assimilate easier into American society. We classify in a very extreme way people by their racial characteristics, the visible traits of the racial characteristics. So being able to assimilate into the overall culture was important if you're going to make it in the United States. But these groups that have been coming after 1960 are people of color. And they're people that have vastly different cultures, religious beliefs, and the lot. And it's creating some animosity in the United States, and not just the United States, all over the globe. When uh, extreme opposites come in contact with each other, there's inevitably going to be conflict. And those that were there first are going to consider themselves the rightful heirs to whatever resources are being shared at the local level. And those who came second are going to be struggling to try and gain access to some of those resources. This competition, as we'll see, is what drives things like prejudice and discrimination, and it's all related to the struggle for position in society. One of the things that we're going to have to ask ourselves is essentially, what is a minority group? Well, the members of the group experience a pattern of disadvantage or inequality. So inequality is a key characteristic of what a minority group is. The members of the group share a visible trait or a characteristic that differentiates them from other groups. However, we need to caution ourselves when naming groups as their names are social conventions whose meanings change from time to time and place to place. So visible characteristics, possibly skin color, skin tone, cultural characteristics, religious characteristics. We're starting to identify people and placing them in categories that are going to have either a majority or minority label attached to them. And of course, the minority group is made up of people who share some commonalities but are at the same time different. When we talk about minority groups, what we're really getting at is that minority status has more to do with the distribution of resources and power than with the simple numbers. Minority groups can be larger than the dominant or majority group. It's just how the distribution of power favors one group over another. In this book, the definition of the minority group is based on Wagley and Harris's 1958 definition. And according to this definition, a minority group has 5 characteristics The first characteristic is inequality. This is most likely the primary defining characteristic of minority groups. You have variable patterns of inequality and exploitation, ranging from slavery, genocide, to institutional discrimination, where hiring practices favor one group over another. Minority or subordinate groups have less of what society values. This goes back to this idea of distribution of resources. Those that get less are considered the minority group, and they're in a minority status. And the pattern is a result of actions by the core or dominant group. Minority groups are not choosing to be minority groups. They're forced into this position by the dominant group or the majority. We have to remember, whatever its scope or severity, whether it extends to wealth, jobs, housing, political power, police protection, or healthcare, the pattern of disadvantage is the key defining characteristic of a minority group. So it's how distribution of resources impacts one group in favor over another. Literally the haves and the have-nots, or Marx's bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. The next characteristic, or as we unpack inequality, we have to take in consideration that stratification, or unequal distribution of value, goods, and resources, is a basic feature of that society. So if you have an unequal society, well, then you have more than likely stratification within your society. The stratification is talking about when societies are divided into horizontal layers or strata. We call these social classes, which differ from one another by the amount of resources they command. A minority group status affects access to property, prestige, and power. And we really need to keep in mind that a stratified society, whether it's a functional society or not, does not necessarily mean, and in many respects, by its structural nature itself, it is designed to produce inequality. When we talk about inequality, what we're really, when we talk about social inequality, and we talk about how, as sociologists, we understand the ideas of social inequality, that really brings us in the realm of social theory. And that's when the primary theoretical perspectives in the discipline that deal with this are Marx, Weber, Linsky, and Patricia Hill Collins. Not to say that this is an exhaustive source, it's just some of the biggies. Marx is talking about class conflict. And he sees that social inequality is tied to those who own the means of production. In a agricultural, pre-industrial world, it would be those that owned the land, those that owned the animals, or those that owned the people and resources that produced what reproduced our daily lives. So in an industrial society, it's those that own the factories, those that own the networks, those that own the banks, those things that are most responsible for the social reproduction of our daily lives. For Marx, there were two classes at play here. There was the bourgeoisie, or those that owned the means of production, and there was the proletariat, or those that did not own the means of production. Marx was primarily looking at an industrial society. Weber, on the other hand, some say he disagreed with Marx. He agreed with Marx's general premise, but he just felt that there was more going on. And instead of just looking at those that owned the means of production, we really needed to look at concepts like prestige and power, which did not always marry up, but most likely did marry up to those that owned the means of production. Gerhard Linsky, once again standing on the shoulders of Weber, which in turn is standing on the shoulders of Marx. He differentiates a little bit and talks about the level of development of a society, moving from subsistence technology to a more complex technological world, and an industrial world, and how those changes impacted the distribution of resources. And of course, Patricia Hill Collins is looking at the matrix of domination. She has some things to say about the dichotomous approach to social inequality, whether it be males versus females, or blacks versus whites, or religious versus non-religious. This dichotomous relationship is too simplified. And she said that if you really wanted to understand discrimination, you really wanted to understand social inequality, you had to look at the multiple dimensions of it in reference to race, class, gender, sexual preference, religious preference. And until you understood it in a complete fashion, you would continue to misinterpret it.